So I rewatched Avatar. Turns out it's pretty good. And I especially like those floating islands. They're pretty damn cool, right? So what I did is I hopped on into After Effects and decided to create my own little floating islands. And of course, I also navified myself, which is pretty sweet. So if you want to see how I made the floating islands, follow along. Alright, so we're kicking things off by just a little bit of research looking at the world of Pandora. Let's kick things off in After Effects by just making the environment. And I'm creating a new solid, and I'm going to be adding a gradient ramp. So you could use a shape layer and use the gradient fill, or you can use a solid and use the gradient ramp effect. For whatever reason, this has just become my preferred workflow. And we're creating a little bit of a sky environment in here with a gradient going from white to blue and creating a camera and a 3D null. We are making the rock, the big centerpiece of our scene, and this is one asset that we're going to be reusing many times over, making some adjustments to over time. So this is really our centerpiece and we want to make it look nice. So I'm just using the pen tool, drawing a shape and then coloring it some sort of a rock type of color. To add some more visual interest to the rock, instead of just hand drawing everything, I'm actually using a fractal noise effect. So I'm setting it to multiply and I'm putting it on top of my rock and using the preserve underlying transparency. So I just have my fractal noise on my rock shape. In these settings, I can just mess around a little bit with the scale and stretch it vertically and stretch it horizontally, and just mess around till I get something that looks nice. Here I'm actually adding a mosaic effect to make it look a bit pixelated, and I'm using expressions to hook up the vertical blocks to the horizontal blocks. So when I change one of them, the other one follows along and I get consistent blocks left and right, up and down. And I'm still messing around a little bit with the blending modes, trying out different options, lowering the opacity, and just getting a little bit of visual interest in there in the style that I'm going for. So instead of having to hand draw a bunch of shapes, I'm just adding that with fractal noise before moving into layering in the big heavy shadows. So I don't really have a plan for exactly what my block is going to end up looking like. I'm just thinking of it as a big floating rock in the sky, inspired by the movie that I watched and wanted to make my own little version in the After Effects 2D world. So I've created a bunch of shapes, and here I'm using the pen tool again, but I'm doing it as masks now, and I'm about to select them all and just set them to subtract. So what I'm doing is I'm creating my heavy shapes for the shadows, and then I'm subtracting certain elements from those shadows to make them a little bit more interesting. Lowering the opacity, then creating a new layer and doing basically the same process of just creating a bunch of shapes for shadows to get another level of shadows to add some more depth to the image that we're looking at. Let's do the opposite now and add some highlights. So exact same strategy. I'm using the pen tool on a new layer and I'm creating a little shape and just changing the color to a lighter brownish. And then I'm drawing a bunch more shapes here and there, all on the same layer, so I can easily just change the color of the whole layer at once if I wanted to do that. And then lowering the opacity a little bit. So we're back to adding some shadows, and now I'm adding shadows to the left and right side to make the whole shape a little bit more three-dimensional. But it's basically just the same process here, just playing around till you get something that looks nice. The overall rock in place, let's add some vines and things to the bottom. So exact same workflow, still just creating a new shape on a new layer and drawing a quick little path and just using a stroke in a certain dark brown color. And I just keep drawing a bunch of these shapes. And I'm keeping this layer at the very top for now, just so I can see what I'm doing, but I'm eventually going to be moving it down into the layer stack, so it's actually below the rock itself. I'm creating a new layer now and doing some green vines instead of the brown ones. So these are sort of like leaves hanging down or something like that. So they're going to be green, not super neon green, but a slightly more green than the other brown vines that we did before. Again, just to get a little bit of differentiation in here. So at this stage, I'm just changing my fractal noise to just use my rock as a matte instead. And I'm going into the vines and adding a zigzag and setting it to smooth to just get some variation to the shape. Let's add the greens and let's plant some trees up here. So I'm just, again, drawing a shape just by hand with the pen tool and making it sort of a greenish color. I'm using a fairly muted color palette in this whole thing. And I'm duplicating my fractal noise layer, changing the settings of it a little bit. And this is what I want to add to only the grass part at the very top. So that's where I'm really looking with my eyes before using that as a matte, like I just changed here. So now we only have that new mosaic at the very top in the green parts, and we still have our original ones on the rock. And now I'm adding a roughen edges effect, which is a really good effect to use to just break up the very digital shapes. And I'm adding a little bit of animation in there to the evolution property, just to get some movement on that thing and not have it be completely static. More shadows, another new layer, just drawing some dark green shapes on top of the green one. And I'm going to be using the green shape as a matte, so they're only shown inside of it. And on the shadows, I'm adding a roughen edges again now, just to make sure that things stay consistent and we don't end up with something overly digital when I'm trying to make some organic shapes. Here we're drawing a new shadow layer. This one is going to be acting as a little bit of ambient occlusion. So it's just sort of casting a shadow from the green parts at the very top down to the brown rock below it. And I'm going to be smoothing that section out a little bit so it's not super crisp as it is now. But that's really what we're doing. So we're adding the roughen edges here as well. And just tweaking the numbers a little bit to get some organic edges to that shape and not have it look overly perfect. Again, you can see a big difference here when I start to up the values. It's starting to get that speckled texture, which is pretty nice and it's going to work well with the style that I'm going for the floating rock that I'm making here. So we're just duplicating that shadow and changing the shape a little bit. Again, thinking of it as ambient occlusion. If you're used to working in 3D programs, that is the little crevice that would cast more shadows, would basically be created in the small sections of a shape like this. So on that same green layer, I'm now going down into my rock and adding more shapes to just have some grass and greenery growing here and there throughout the entire shape. And same thing for my shadow. So to not have a million layers in here, I'm just creating a bunch of shapes on the same layer that is using the same color. And now I'm going back and creating the same type of vines that we did before, but these ones are going to be in front of my big rock shape. So I'm sort of connecting different parts to each other just to have some vines going across the whole shape and break things up a little bit. And on the highlight layer, I'm just adding tiny little highlights here and there for where the vines connect. So they're starting and ending point, basically, just to give some more contrast and guide the viewer's eyes a little bit towards those vines that we just created, so we don't end up with just a big blob of brown. We want to be able to art direct the thing we're making and be deliberate about where we're placing our shadows and our highlights to get a nice overall look and feel for the big rock that we're doing. Adding some vines in the green shades at the very top again. And at the very top of the whole thing, I've created an adjustment layer and I've now added roughen edges to the entire thing. So this is going to be affecting every single layer below itself. And that means that I can get that organic hand-drawn look to my entire composition. And doing this is pretty render heavy, but the end result ends up looking nice. So it's all a push and pull on time versus quality. We're back in our scene and we're pulling in our big rock. It's way too big, so we're scaling it down and immediately turning it into a 3D layer. If you watched any of my tutorials in the past, you know that this is my preferred workflow of creating assets in their own composition and then bringing it all together into our scene as 3D layers, because that means that we're able to place the rocks throughout the scene in various Z positions, so that will be the depth of the scene. So some rocks are going to be closer to us as the viewer or as the camera, some are going to be further away, and that will give us the ability to have more depth in our scene compared to if we were just having a completely flat 2D scene. And here I'm just adding some simple animation to the camera itself to sort of emphasize this depth that we've created within our scene. So we have a camera going down from the top of the sky, settling down on our rocks, and then we have a subtle push in that is animated on the anchor point throughout the entire scene. You could use the depth of field in the camera itself, but because I want to be very specific about my blurs, I'm just adding an effect to the ones closest to us as viewers. Let's go ahead and make some clouds, and I'm starting off by a designed cloud. I'm making it in its own composition, and I'm calling this cloud style 1. So this is just a shape that I'm drawing, and then I'm doing a mask to subtract part of that shape at the very bottom, just so I have an illustrated design for my cloud that I think looks nice. Then I'm adding another mask and setting it to subtract, and I'm going to push the feather up quite a bit here. So I'm really getting that soft fall off where I'm really mainly looking at the top parts of the cloud, and then that fades into the distance. And now that I put that into the scene, you can see that that looks pretty sweet when we start to put that white faded cloud into our background. And I'm adding a simple expression here just to have a bit of horizontal movement on my cloud. I'm making it move using the time of the composition multiplied by 10 on the x-axis only, and I'm keeping the y and the z-axis as they are. And if you're interested in learning more about that type of thing, I do have an upcoming expression tutorial that is going to be covering the basics of expressions. That's part of my Introduction to After Effects course. So stay tuned, that is coming on the channel, and this would be a pretty good opportunity to subscribe.
Perfect.
At this point, I'm just duplicating the cloud and moving it here and there in Z space, scaling it down, scaling it up, moving it around. And inside of my cloud composition, I can still always make adjustments to the shape itself. And in here, I've added a turbulent displace effect, acting in a similar way as the roughen edges, but in more blobby fashion. I'm adding a turbulent displace that gives a little bit of organic movement to my shape throughout my entire composition. And again, just animating the evolution using very simple time expression instead of setting keyframes. And now I have some clouds with a little bit of movement in my scene, and I can always keep duplicating my rocks and moving them around and changing the entire layout of my scene throughout the entire process. And here we're adding clouds style 2. So we're diving back into the fractal noise effect that we used before to create some of those cloudy shapes. You can see already on the screen, this kind of does look like clouds and is nice to use, but I'm using it in combination with the style 1 that we drew using the pen tool to make sure that the style is consistent overall in my scene, but I can use fractal noise to my advantage and just have a little bit of these classic cloudy shapes moving across my scene from left to right. And on that layer, I'm going to go ahead and change the blending mode to screen. So I'm kicking out all of the black and just keeping the whites. And I'm adding a mask, and I'm going to be adding a big feather to this one as well, just like we did to our cloud before. And now you'll see we're adding a bit of visual interest in here as well, making it feel more real, even though we're working in a simplified, sort of cartoony style. We can still use some of these elements and techniques as long as we maintain the art direction that we're going for and don't just end up throwing a bunch of effects into the thing. So we're going to be making a tree, and for that tree I'm just duplicating my rock composition and deleting everything I don't need, and on my grass layer at the very top I'm drawing a bunch more shapes, I'm drawing a bunch more vines. At this point I have sped up this footage quite a bit because I'm not really using any new techniques at this point. I'm doing the exact same thing as we did before, but I'm just doing it to a tree instead. So I've created a shape for my tree, and then I'm creating a new layer for all of the little branches where I'm just using the stroke instead of the fill. I'm able to very easily draw a bunch of shapes like this to look like branches, and I can do that in different shades to give a little bit more depth to the scene as well, and get some trees that I think look cool. And again, adding shadows to the tree shape itself just by creating a bunch of black shapes here and there that I'm then going to be using the preserve underlying transparency for and knocking down the opacity a bit. And as you can see, this tree is very, very tiny, so all of that detail that we added, maybe even too much detail because it's so small in the final end result. But if I want to use that tree for something else in the future, I've already made a fairly detailed version, so no time wasted. Now I'm creating a separate composition for the big vines. They're going to be connecting two of the rocks together. So the two ones sort of in the middle here, those two are going to be having a little bit of a bridge created with these vines connecting them together. And I'm just doing this as in a separate composition to be able to focus on the design process alone, where I have just my branches or my vines at first in the brownish color. Then I'm creating a new layer in the greenish color and drawing some vines hanging down there as well to use the same techniques and use the same style that I've already established and that I've used on my rock and on my tree. I want to make sure that I'm working in the same way in this asset as well, so that everything feels connected and cohesive. So let's make some birds. At this point, it's a bunch of rocks in the sky, but it's hard to judge the scale of everything. And that's where adding some birds into a scene like this can be a very good technique for just establishing how large or how small the thing that we're looking at is, because we don't really have a point of reference as the scene stands right now. So I'm creating a new composition with just a very, very simple bird design. It's just a silhouette basically, or a completely black bird. And it's just 1 second long where I'm animating one full wing flap. So the wings move from the top to the bottom, back to the top. And this will then be looping. So I don't have to worry about animating the birds for 15 seconds. I can just do 1 second. And I have my two wings in there. And now I'm creating a new composition, which is going to be my flock of birds. So in here I have my bird, and I want to wiggle it a little bit on the position so you don't just have a static bird in the middle. So I'm connecting my position to two sliders that allow me to change the wiggling amount. And again, if you're not used to working with the wiggle expression or working with expressions in general, I do have an upcoming tutorial based on this kind of stuff. But really what I'm doing is I'm connecting one bird to the wiggle sliders that allows me to control how many times per second and how much it wiggles. I'm then duplicating that bird and just positioning 4 or 5 different ones in the same composition. So I have one collected flock of birds that I can now pull into my scene. And this flock of birds I can just animate as one single composition. So I'm moving it to the right side of the screen, and then moving it to the left side of the screen and having that big block of birds just sort of fly across the scene throughout my timeline, just to have a little bit of something happening in here. It also helps us to establish how these rocks are way up in the sky and establish a little bit of the scale. So after staring at this for a while, I wanted to blend in my rocks in the background a little bit more to the atmosphere. And I'm doing that by using a curves effect like this. Let's go ahead and make the banshee, as it's apparently called. After some Googling, I was able to find a couple images of this thing, and I'm just going to be doing a super simple version of this. So I'm taking my bird composition, duplicating that, and here I'm just taking the shapes that I've already drawn and changing them up a little bit to make it look closer to that little banshee dude that the Avatar people came up with for the movie. So I'm just changing the shape. This is just a shape layer where I'm just adding points, and I'm changing the Bezier curves and moving things around to sort of resemble the silhouette of that banshee. Sort of. This thing is going to end up being even more tiny than the birds and the trees, so I'm not really spending a whole lot of time on this. But that's kind of the whole thing. Is it perfect? No, not really. Does it have to be? No, not really. It's going to be way in the background, but it does add a little bit of more something happening to our scene. And I mean, it is a thing created in the Avatar universe, so I guess it's more Avatar street cred than just adding some birds in there. So I'm putting in my banshee, and I'm just scaling it down and pushing it way back in the background, because I don't really want to have this guy center stage. The focus is on the floating islands. That is the cool thing that I wanted to recreate, and I'm just adding this guy in there too. And at this stage, we kind of have everything that we want in place. Just time to make some final tweaks here and there, and nothing new, nothing groundbreaking happening at this stage, but I think it's just interesting to see. Again, this is sped up footage, so just sort of showing you what I'm doing when I'm tinkering around, because this is the part of the process that could be 5 minutes or could be 5 hours, because it's really up to you and how much time you want to spend on it. After I had been staring at this for a while, I started to think that all of the rocks looked the same. So I just duplicated that composition, created one called Rock 2, and I'm going to be replacing a few of them in the scene with Rock 2 instead of my original rock composition. And I'm just moving the shapes around a little bit here and there. So now you can see a few of them are sort of not as tall as the main guy in the middle. And that, again, just brings a little bit of diversity to the whole thing. And I can just add a waterfall in there as well to, again, add one final push of something that we want to put in there. But I keep saying final thing and final change. That's really the thing that you learn over time when doing this, is that yes, you could spend an eternity working on this thing. But a waterfall is nice because that is also one of those very recognizable, cool fantasy things. We've all seen a bunch of tiny waterfalls here and there in Lord of the Rings and similar things that also acts as a great indicator of scale. And that's why it works so well in a concept like this, where you have a big floating rock. You don't really know if it's a floating pebble or if it's a gigantic floating rock in the sky until you start to add some of these elements in there to establish the scale of everything. And in here, I'm just using a simple, just hand-drawn shape and then a circle at the bottom that's going to be sort of acting as foam connected to the wiggle sliders. The balls at the bottom are mainly, or pretty much not really going to be included because of the feather that I'm going to add to this later on, but it's going to be fading off into the distance where you get a little bit of a hint of those shapes in there. So it doesn't hurt to add that, but you should be aware of how is this thing going to be used in my final scene and how much of it am I actually going to be seeing, to sort of gauge what is worth spending your time on and what can you simplify. Like the banshee in the background, do I need to add all of the tiny details to that thing? Not really. And same thing for the waterfall. It doesn't have to be the most advanced particle system. I'm just using a very simple shape layer approach and adding a little bit of wiggle and that kind of stuff to just have it looking like water is flowing out. And then there's a wave warp on top of it just to give that little bit of wavy, watery motion. And that's kind of it. And that's pretty much it. Let's have a look at the final thing. Welcome to Pandora. Dun 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 dun. All right, I hope you liked this tutorial, and make sure you stick around for my upcoming tutorial on the groundbreaking visual effects inspired by Avatar 2, The Way of Water. Here's a little sneak peek. I mean, wow, would you look at that? Amazing, right?
I'm under the water. Please help me.
So make sure you like and subscribe. Blub, blub, blub.